Welcome to another dark night on the channel. Mr. Nightmare scares you. For those of you who are just arriving in search of the unknown and scary stories, make yourselves at home, but lock your doors well. And for those of you who are already subscribers and our partners in late-night horror sessions, prepare yourselves for another one of our real and disturbing tales. Before we begin the story, let's meet the person who lived through this terrifying experience. Mark, 28, from Seattle, Washington, shared this story that will change the way you see the night. I was never the type to believe in monsters or urban legends. I've always been a skeptical guy who sought logic in absolutely everything. My life in Seattle was peaceful, divided between my work and my relationship with Sarah, an incredible woman, but one who carried with her a ghost from the past that robbed me of my peace. Her ex-boyfriend David was an unstable, possessive guy who simply couldn't accept the end of the relationship, haunting our lives like a constant threat. I always suspected his intentions, feeling that sooner or later he would try something terrible against us, and this paranoia consumed me daily. On that particular night, the atmosphere was dense. A thick fog covered the city, and the fine drizzle made the asphalt slippery, creating a perfect setting for the terror that was about to unfold. We had gone to the movies at a mall further from the center, about 15 miles from our house, trying to have a normal night away from our worries. The movie ended late, past midnight, and the parking lot was practically deserted, lit only by a few intermittently flickering yellowish lights. As soon as we stepped through the glass doors toward my car, a chill ran down my spine, and the survival instinct screamed in my mind. About 200 feet away, leaning against a concrete pillar, was David's dark pickup truck, its headlights off, but with the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. The fear wasn't of the supernatural at that moment. It was the real fear of an unbalanced man who had clearly followed us there and who seemed ready to do the worst. Sarah gripped my arm tightly, her fingers digging into my jacket as she whispered it was him, confirming my worst nightmare of the night. I told her not to look back, to walk quickly and get in the car as fast as possible, trying to maintain a steady posture while my heart pounded wildly. As soon as I unlocked the vehicle and we got in, the sound of David's truck engine echoed through the empty parking lot, a deep rumble that cut through the silence and announced that the chase had begun. I sped toward the exit, ignoring the speed limits, watching in my rearview mirror as his high beams flashed and the dark vehicle sped off toward us. He was intent on hurting us. This was evident in the aggressive way he tailgated my car, flashing his lights and revving the engine to try and force us off the wet road. To try and lose him, I made a risky decision and left the main highway, entering a secondary road that cut through a dense forested area on the outskirts of King County. A path lined with gigantic pine trees that were over 100 feet tall. The darkness there was almost absolute, swallowing the light of my headlights and creating a claustrophobic tunnel of branches and fog where there was no cell phone signal or any living soul to call for help. The tension inside the car was unbearable. The silence was only broken by Sarah's panting breath and the sound of the tires cutting through puddles on the uneven asphalt. David continued on our heels, less than 50 feet away, acting like a crazed predator. The chase dragged on for several more miles into that forgotten forest, the hairpin turns testing my tire's grip every second. I was so focused on not losing control of the car and monitoring David's blinding headlights in the rearview mirror that I barely noticed the bizarre change in our surroundings. A feeling of absolute dread filled the air, something far older and more primal than the human threat right behind us, a chill that froze my bones and made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It was then that, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a movement on the right side of the road, keeping pace with my car, which was going almost 60 miles per hour. Initially, I thought it was a large deer or a frightened bear running through the trees, but the way the figure moved was completely wrong. It was bipedal, agile, and incredibly fast. The dark shape ran parallel to the road, just a few feet from the shoulder, destroying the smaller bushes with brutal force while keeping up with our pace without showing any effort. Sarah also saw it and let out a muffled scream, pointing with a trembling hand towards the window, completely paralyzed by the shock of what her eyes were trying to process. The creature must have easily been over 7 feet tall, covered in a dense, dark fur that blended into the shadows of the forest. It wasn't an ordinary animal. It was something out of the worst nightmares, something I had only heard about in real accounts of encounters with Dogman, stories I always considered to be delusions or internet hoaxes. Absolute terror gripped me, my panic torn between the psychopathic ex-boyfriend right behind me and the colossal abomination hunting us along the side of the road. The creature made no vocal sounds, only the heavy thud of its footsteps crushing vegetation and breaking thick branches as if they were toothpicks. It ran upright, but with a slightly forward-leaning posture, revealing massive muscles that tensed beneath its dark skin with each long stride, demonstrating inconceivable physical strength. In a moment of pure desperation, the monster leaped over a drainage ditch with frightening ease and landed on the edge of the asphalt, illuminated for a fraction of a second by my car's taillights. The sight was nauseating. It had a head resembling that of a huge wolf, but with grotesquely distorted features, incredibly broad shoulders, and long arms ending in sharp claws that gleamed in the dim light. His eyes reflected a sickly yellowish color, focused directly on my vehicle with a predatory, malevolent intelligence that no wild animal would ever possess. He wasn't just running aimlessly, he was escorting us, cornering us on that deserted road. I glanced in the rearview mirror and realized David had also noticed the creature's presence, as his truck began to zigzag across the road, slowing drastically as he tried to understand what the hell was running alongside him. What happened next was swift and utterly brutal, etching the image of that carnage into my mind forever. The Dogman suddenly changed course, abandoning the side of my car and veering diagonally into the middle of the road, heading straight for David's truck that was right behind it. Through my mirrors, I saw the exact moment the monster collided with the side of my ex-girlfriend's vehicle, and the impact was so absurd that the heavy truck, weighing thousands of pounds, was thrown off the road. The metal crumpled grotesquely, and the vehicle spun in the air before violently flipping over into the ditch, smashing against the pine trunks in a cloud of dirt, leaves, and destruction. I slammed on the brakes purely by instinct, making the tires slide across the wet asphalt until we stopped about 200 feet from the crash site. The silence that followed was sepulchral, broken only by the sound of my sputtering engine and the fine rain hitting the windshield. We were alive. The man who wanted to kill us had been terribly neutralized, but there was no celebration because we knew the real nightmare had just begun. Slowly, amidst the smoke billowing from the destroyed hood of David's truck, a gigantic dark figure rose on 2 legs, turning its monstrous head toward our stopped car. He had ended our human pursuit, and now his yellow eyes were fixed on us. To help you understand the sheer weight of what we were experiencing there, and the terror that froze my blood, I need to take a step back and explain the oppressive scenario we found ourselves in. The area around Seattle isn't like a typical suburb where help is always right next door. When you leave the main interstate highways and enter the back roads of King County, you're almost instantly swallowed by a dark, impenetrable green wall. We're talking about primary forests, immense untouched areas where colossal pine trees easily exceed 200 feet in height, forming a natural canopy that blocks any trace of moonlight. The smell there is constant and heavy, a suffocating mixture of damp earth, wet moss, and decaying wood, something that penetrates your lungs and reminds you how isolated you are. Ironically, it was precisely this brutal isolation that Sarah and I were seeking when we decided to move to a more secluded rental house about 25 miles from the city center. Our intention was to create a geographical shield, a desperate attempt to hide from the psychotic advances of her ex-boyfriend. We thought physical distance would bring peace, but there, with the car stopped on that deserted road, enveloped by the thick fog rising from the asphalt, I realized the colossal mistake we had made. The darkness around us wasn't just a lack of light. It was a dense, almost palpable darkness that seemed to absorb even the glare of my headlights. There were no streetlights, no signs, and the nearest cell tower must have been dozens of miles away, rendering our phones completely useless. We ourselves had walked into a perfect natural cage, far from any authority, any witnesses or any chance of quick help. The icy Pacific wind filtered through the cracks in my car window, bringing with it a constant shiver that mixed our human vulnerability with the absolute terror of facing the inexplicable in those dense woods. I felt my hands sweating as they gripped the leather steering wheel, while my mind struggled to process the fact that the forest that was supposed to protect us had become the perfect slaughterhouse. The wind chill must have felt like 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but sweat dripped down my face as if I were in an oven, a clear sign that my body was going into shock and preparing my nervous system for what was about to happen. The presence of that colossal creature in front of us was something impossible, but the human terror that had driven us to that cursed road was very real and palpable months ago. David wasn't just a guy who hadn't gotten over a breakup. He was a stubborn sociopath, a habitual stalker who had turned Sarah's life into a true psychological nightmare. He used to send dozens of threatening messages in the middle of the night, show up uninvited at the places we used to eat, and sometimes I found cigarette butts of the brand he smoked just a few feet from the porch of our isolated house. The weight of this constant stalking destroyed our peace, forcing us to look over our shoulders all the time, to check the door locks 3 or 4 times a night, and to live in a state of alert that drained our energy. That movie at the cinema had been our first attempt in weeks to pretend we had a normal life, to forget David's shadow for a few hours. The macabre irony of the situation was that the human monster who had relentlessly hunted us for months had just been crushed by an infinitely worse predator, something straight out of the darkest and most terrifying legends imaginable. The fear I felt for David was understandable, the fear of a firearm, of physical aggression, of the hatred etched on the face of an unbalanced man. But the fear emanating from that gigantic figure standing beside the wrecked truck was something cosmic, a biological terror that activated survival instincts from thousands of years ago when humanity was still the prey in the dark nights. Sarah kept her hands covering her face, sobbing softly, completely unable to cope with the total rupture of reality we were witnessing. She had spent months fearing being killed by her ex-boyfriend, and now the man who terrorized her was possibly dead, mutilated or trapped in the wreckage of a 4,000-pound vehicle, while the one responsible for the destruction watched him like a hunter assessing the carcass of his prey. Our small human tragedy had been swallowed up by a horror of mythical proportions, and the insignificance of our marital problems vanished before the animalistic grandeur of the creature that now ruled that road. The environment around us transformed into a true sensory hell that I will never be able to erase from my memory. After the violent sound of the impact and the metal tearing against the gigantic tree trunks, the forest plunged into an absolute and disturbing silence, the kind of stillness that precedes the worst storms. There was no song of nocturnal insects, no rustling of leaves in the wind. Even the birds and small rodents seemed to have disappeared or held their breath, aware that the supreme alpha predator was walking there. Soon after, the smells began to invade the interior of my car through the ventilation ducts, creating a nauseating mixture that turned my stomach. First came the acrid odor of burning rubber and melted asphalt, the result of the abrupt braking of both vehicles. Then the metallic smell of boiling radiator fluid and spilled oil rose from David's overturned truck, accompanied by a grey smoke that further hampered our vision. But nothing, Absolutely nothing compared to the unholy stench emanating from the Dogman. It was a pestilent odor, a repulsive mixture of decomposing flesh, wet dog, and old blood, so strong and thick it felt like it was sticking to the back of my throat. Every time the creature moved within a mere 100 feet of us, a new whiff of this deathly smell swept through the air, forcing me to hold my breath to avoid vomiting on the car's dashboard. The heat from my intermittently sputtering engine contrasted with the damp cold outside, fogging the windows and creating a terrifyingly claustrophobic atmosphere. I wanted to roll down the window to clear my view, but the mere thought of eliminating that fragile glass barrier between us and the outside sent uncontrollable shivers down my spine. Through the partially fogged windows, I could see small pieces of plastic and glass reflecting the faint midnight light scattered across the ground, marking a trail of destruction. That isolated stretch of highway had turned into a slaughterhouse, and we were trapped in the front row seats tasting the tragedy in the air and listening to the heavy, agonizing sound of the truck's metal frame collapsing under the creature's weight. It was at that moment that the smoke briefly dissipated due to a gust of wind, allowing my car's headlights to illuminate the Dogman in its entirety, revealing the true face of the nightmare. If I had to estimate, I would say that he easily stood between 7 and 8 feet tall in his slightly hunched posture, and must have weighed somewhere between 500 or 600 pounds of pure muscle mass. He was imposing, menacing, and undeniably male, with an absurdly wide chest structure that tapered to a narrow waist, vaguely resembling the anatomy of a bodybuilder, but covered in dense, rough, coal-black fur. His arms were disproportionately long, extending almost to his knees, and displayed defined muscles that contorted beneath the skin with every movement. The hands, or rather the claws of that abomination, were immense, equipped with thick fingers and curved nails that measured at least 5 inches and seemed to be made of dark, resistant horn, capable of tearing steel with the same ease as they would tear human flesh. The head was the most disturbing aspect of its entire macabre composition. It resembled that of a colossal tundra wolf with pointed ears, an elongated snout, and exposed canines dripping thick saliva. However, it was not the head of an irrational animal. The shape of the skull had a subtle elevation, and the eyes, those terrible eyes of a luminous and sickly amber hue, were positioned more frontally, giving it an expression of malevolent and calculating intelligence that no natural wolf would possess. I watched, completely paralyzed by shock, as the alpha male raised one of his monumental claws and buried it in the crumpled door of David's truck, tearing the heavy metal as if he were opening a cheap aluminum can. The display of brute force was paralyzing. He was inspecting the interior of the destroyed vehicle, searching for his prey with sadistic curiosity, demonstrating that he attacked not only out of hunger or territorial instinct, but also out of a perverse pleasure in hunting and destroying everything that crossed his path. The reality of our situation crashed down on me with the weight of an anvil. We were trapped less than 150 feet from a relentless predator. My car showed clear signs of engine failure due to overheating during David's desperate escape, and Sarah was on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown in the passenger seat. I knew we needed to get out of there immediately, that every second of hesitation exponentially diminished our chances of survival. Slowly, I moved my trembling hand toward the gear shift, trying to engage reverse to silently back away across the dark asphalt. The plan was to move the car away without attracting the attention of the monster that was busy scrutinizing the truck's wreckage. However, as soon as I moved the lever, the vehicle's transmission emitted a sharp, dry, mechanical creak, a terrible noise that definitively broke the funereal silence of the forest. It was the fatal mistake. Immediately the Dogman ceased its brutal movements against the twisted metal. He released the truck door, letting it fall to the damp dirt floor and swung his massive torso toward us with incredible agility for a creature of that size. That pair of bright, sulfur-colored eyes fixed directly on my windshield, piercing the darkness and meeting my terrified gaze. He knew perfectly well that we had been there the whole time. He had simply saved dessert for last. The creature tilted its head to the side, as if studying the vehicle, and began to take its first slow, deliberate step toward us, moving away from David's vehicle and focusing all its macabre attention on us. The air inside the cabin seemed to have been sucked out all at once. The temperature plummeted drastically, and primal panic seized every fiber of my being, announcing that the human game of cat and mouse was over, and the true test of survival against the unknown was only beginning. The 150 feet separating us seemed to decrease at an agonizing speed, yet too fast for my mind to process an escape route. The creature didn't run towards us, and that's what made it infinitely more terrifying. It walked with a calculated slowness, heavy, rhythmic steps that demonstrated absolute control over the environment and over us. With each step that colossal male took on the damp asphalt, the muscles of its hind legs flexed with terrifying power, revealing the anatomy of a perfect hunter, molded by the cruelest and most relentless nature to destroy. I was frozen in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were completely white and numb. The icy air that invaded the car didn't seem enough to fill my lungs, and a feeling of suffocation took hold of me, a primal panic that paralyzed my vocal cords and drained any vestige of rationality. Sarah, beside me, had shrunk into her seat, hugging her knees and hiding her face as she trembled uncontrollably, murmuring disjointed prayers in an almost inaudible whisper. The silence on the road was oppressive. The fine rain continued to fall on the metal roof of our vehicle, but the only sound that truly mattered was the heavy noise of the Dogman's claws scraping against the ground with each new step. He kept his monstrous head slightly lowered, but his gleaming eyes never left our windshield, piercing the thin glass barrier and analyzing us as if we were mere pieces of meat packaged for his consumption. The feeling of powerlessness was overwhelming. We were just fragile humans, confined in a damaged metal box, isolated from the civilized world by dozens of miles of dense forest, awaiting the inevitable slaughter at the hands of a being that shouldn't exist in our reality. When the creature crossed the 50-foot mark, my survival instinct finally overcame the paralysis of absolute terror. I needed to start the car. I needed to make that metal and oil engine respond to my commands, or we would die right there, torn to pieces in the darkness. I turned the key in the ignition with desperate violence, forcing the mechanism, but the engine only emitted a choked, dying sound, refusing to start. The overheating during the insane escape through the county roads had taken its toll at the worst possible moment. With each failed attempt to start, the Dogman seemed to subtly accelerate its pace, shortening the distance to 30 feet, 20 feet. The stench of death and putrefaction emanating from it became so concentrated and nauseating that my eyes began to water, and my stomach clenched in a violent urge to vomit. In the rearview mirror, I could see just how gigantic it was up close. It completely blocked the view of the trees in the background, a mountain of darkness and muscle that absorbed the dim light of the surroundings. The details of its rain-soaked fur became clear, thick, matted strands covering its broad chest and massive shoulders. Its elongated snout was wrinkled in an expression of silent fury, revealing rows of jagged, stained teeth, dripping thick saliva that evaporated upon touching the cold asphalt. I tried turning the key for the 4th time, sweat streaming down my face and blurring my vision, while psychological terror drove me to the brink of madness. Sarah noticed the mechanical failure and began to cry desperately, squeezing my arm with surprising force, begging me to get us out of there, to do something. But there was nothing to be done. We were completely at the mercy of the nightmare, trapped in a perfect snare, watching death approach with long, heavy strides, ready to face the devastating impact of that bestial force. The creature finally reached the front of our vehicle, and the reality of its colossal scale shattered any hope of resistance I might still have harbored. It was so tall that even bent over, its head hovered above the car's roof, blocking the little light and casting a terrifying shadow over us. With sadistic slowness, the male raised both arms and placed its gigantic palms on the metal hood. The car's front suspension groaned loudly, abruptly buckling under the hundreds of pounds of weight applied to the bodywork. The entire vehicle tilted forward, and the sound of metal clinking and paint being scratched by deep claws tore through the silence of the cabin. We were inches away from it, separated only by a layer of glass that, in the face of that display of brute force, seemed as fragile as paper. The dogman's amber eyes were fixed on mine, a visual connection that conveyed a pure, ancient malevolence, an inherent hatred for everything that crossed its domain. I could see the hot steam escaping from its wide nostrils, with each measured breath fogging the outside of the glass. It lowered its head until its monstrous snout was aligned with the center of the windshield, inspecting the car's interior. The feeling of being the object of study for a top predator is indescribable. It's a terror that nullifies your humanity and reduces you to a state of pure animal prey. Sarah was huddled on the passenger floor, in a catatonic state of shock, completely unable to react. I held my breath motionless, knowing that any sudden movement could be interpreted as a challenge or an incentive for the final attack. The creature slowly raised its right hand, its long fingers with sharp nails grazing the glass surface with a macabre lightness, testing the resistance of the only barrier preventing its prey from being torn apart right there. Time seemed to freeze in that terrible instant when the monster's claw rested on the windshield, waiting for the moment to deliver the fatal blow that would shatter the glass and end our lives. I had accepted the end. My mind was exhausted. Fear had consumed every reserve of energy in my body. It was precisely in that second of absolute resignation that a hoarse, agonizing noise cut through the forest air, coming from the direction of the wrecked truck 18 or 20 feet behind the creature. It was David's voice. He wasn't dead. The psychopathic ex-boyfriend who had chased us to that hell was alive, trapped in the wreckage, and had let out a prolonged groan of pain and despair. Immediately the dogman's pointed ears moved, capturing the vibration of the human sound with surgical precision. The creature instantly removed its claw from our window and twisted its bull-like neck toward the wrecked vehicle. The change in behavior was drastic. The sadistic curiosity he harbored for us was replaced by the savage instinct to take down the wounded and defenseless prey that was most accessible. The predator averted his penetrating gaze from us, dropped his weight onto the hood, causing the car to sway violently as it returned to its normal height, and began walking back to the ruins of David's truck. It was as if a weight of tons had been lifted from my shoulders, but the feeling of relief was immediately crushed by the grim realization of what was about to happen. The man who had turned Sarah's life into hell, who had followed us down the road with murderous intentions, was about to suffer a fate far worse than any human punishment could inflict. The dogman advanced with quick, aggressive steps, focused on the twisted metal structure, preparing to dismember the obstacle and extract his bloody reward. The creature's distraction granted us a tiny window of opportunity, a macabre miracle forged in the blood of the man who wanted us dead. I had no time for moral dilemmas, no room in my mind for pity or guilt for abandoning David to his fate in the clutches of an abomination. The instinct for survival took complete control. With my hands still trembling, I turned the key in the ignition for the umpteenth time, praying to whatever force in the universe would make the mechanics work again. The engine sputtered twice, and surprisingly, came back to life with a rough, uneven jolt. Without hesitating for a single millisecond, I pulled the lever into reverse and pressed the accelerator. The tires slid on the wet asphalt for a fraction of a second before gaining traction, violently throwing the car backward into the darkness of the road. In the fleeting glare of my headlights fading, I could see the terrifying scene unfolding in the background. The Dogman had reached the wrecked side of the truck. With a brutal, primal movement, he plunged his long arms into the driver's side metalwork, tearing through the steel panels and the remains of the windshield as if opening a plastic wrapper. The sound of the metal giving way was followed by a shrill human scream filled with genuine terror, a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I continued accelerating backward, pushing the car back dozens of feet, plunging the vehicle back into the total darkness of the secondary highway before braking sharply and engaging main gear. Adrenaline pulsed through my veins like fire. My breathing was erratic, and Sarah remained hidden in the floorboards, oblivious to our momentary escape. I turned the steering wheel and sped down the winding road, distancing ourselves from the killing zone. But I knew deep down that our ordeal was not over. The creature had memorized our scent. It had looked into my eyes, and a predator of that caliber never forgets prey that escaped its clutches. I drove the next 5 miles with the accelerator, pressed to the limit that the damaged engine could handle, cutting through the darkness of the back road at almost 80 miles per hour. The temperature gauge on the dashboard was in the absolute red, warning that the engine block was about to melt. But my mind couldn't care less about mechanical damage when the threat of being dismembered alive still pulsed through my veins. The forest around us passed like a dark and menacing blur, with the colossal pine trunks forming a seemingly endless tunnel, swallowing the light of the headlights and keeping us prisoners of that oppressive landscape. Sarah had finally climbed out of the car and was sitting in the passenger seat, hugging her knees with a fixed, empty gaze, completely traumatized by the sound of her ex-boyfriend being brutally attacked a few hundred feet from us. I tried to formulate words of comfort. I wanted to say that we were safe, that the creature had stayed behind with its prey, but my throat was dry and terror still gripped my jaw. That's when a terrifying reality began to unfold in my mind. That alpha male, easily weighing over 600 pounds, possessed an anatomy built for hunting and long-distance racing. He had accompanied us on the road before, running parallel to my car at 60 miles per hour without showing the slightest sign of fatigue. The idea that he could finish off David quickly and resume the chase for the sheer sadistic pleasure of hunting us made my stomach drop. My car, weighing over 3,000 pounds, was losing power with every mile, sputtering and choking as the overheated transmission begged for a break. The smell of burnt rubber and oil filled the cabin, mingling with the cold sweat that soaked my clothes, creating a constant reminder that our escape was only a temporary and fragile illusion. My worst prediction came true before we could even reach the intersection with the main highway, about 2 miles from our current location. The engine emitted a deep, agonizing metallic groan, followed by a complete loss of traction in the front wheels, and the vehicle simply died in motion, sliding across the wet asphalt until it came to a complete stop on the shoulder, surrounded by a wall of 100-foot-tall trees. The dashboard lights flickered erratically before going out altogether, plunging the cabin into total darkness, illuminated only by the faint, ghostly glow of the moon trying to penetrate the thick fog. The silence that followed the engine's death was deafening, broken only by our panting breath and the sound of the fine rain that had fallen again on the metal roof. I tried turning the key in the ignition repeatedly, but the electrical system was completely inoperative. We were immobilized, trapped inside a metal box in the heart of the Washington forest, without communication and without weapons. I told Sarah to stay calm, even though my own hands were trembling so much I could barely hold the steering wheel. The air quickly grew thick and icy. The outside temperature must have been dropping to around 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but the cold wasn't our main concern. A subtle vibration, almost imperceptible at first, began to travel through the asphalt, rising up through the tires and reaching our seats. It wasn't the wind. It was the rhythmic, heavy sound of massive footsteps rapidly approaching from behind the vehicle. Before I could look in the fogged rear-view mirror, a colossal impact struck the rear of the car, propelling the back of the vehicle almost 3 feet forward and whipping our bodies from our seats. The predator hadn't been satisfied with just one victim. It had tracked us through the darkness and was now claiming its prey. Immediately after the rear-end impact, we felt the creature's absurd weight being transferred onto the car. The rear suspension creaked painfully as its sharp claws tore through the paint and metal of the trunk, securing their grip. Then, the vehicle's roof structure began to give way under the pressure of hundreds of pounds of pure muscle concentrated in a single point. The headliner sank toward us, accompanied by the agonizing sound of bending steel. It was walking on top of us. Sarah and I cowered in our seats, trying to protect ourselves from the imminent pressure, completely powerless against the brutal force that was deforming the metal cage that should have protected us. The indescribable, putrid smell of decaying flesh and old blood returned to invade the vehicle's interior, this time even stronger and more concentrated, forcing its way through the ventilation gaps and clinging to my skin. The colossal male's deep guttural breathing reverberated through the car's chassis, a frequency so low and menacing that it made my chest vibrate in response. Slowly, the pressure on the roof shifted, moving to the right side of the vehicle, directly above the door where Sarah was sitting. I saw the expression of pure panic on her face, her wide eyes reflecting the little light that entered the car as she tried to pull away from the window and press her body against the center console. The monster's thick, curved claws began to scrape against the side of the door, digging into the metal with torturous slowness, searching for a way to insert its claws and tear the entire door off. The metal groaned and cracked, indicating that it wouldn't withstand the applied force for much longer. We were about to be exposed. Our little sanctuary had transformed into a claustrophobic and deadly trap where there was no room to escape and no strength to fight. The creature stopped scratching at the car's metal and lowered its massive torso, aligning its monstrous head directly with the passenger side window. The alpha male's face was less than 10 inches from Sarah's, separated only by a thin layer of tempered glass that offered no real resistance. The close-up view was infinitely more disturbing than when we saw it from afar. Its broad snout was wrinkled, its dark lips retracted, revealing double rows of sharp, dark, reddish-stained teeth, evidence that it had just fed on its first victim. The creature's hot, moist breath completely fogged the outside glass, forcing the monster to rub its snout against the surface to keep its vision clear. Its sickly yellow eyes swept across the car's interior, passing over Sarah and fixing on me with an intensity that paralyzed my vocal cords. There was a cruel and ancient intelligence in those eyes, a consciousness that perfectly understood our despair and fed on the terror emanating from us. He raised his right hand, pressing his long fingers against the glass, his claws, more than 4 inches long, resting gently on the transparent surface. The message was clear and terrifying. He could shatter that barrier the moment he wished. The outside world had completely disappeared, leaving only the suffocating cabin of my car and the abysmal presence of the predator watching us. My mind completely collapsed, accepting that the end of the line had arrived and that the next few seconds would be the last of our lives, filled with pain and a brutality that my brain refused to fully process. The Dogman flexed his arm muscles, preparing to deliver the blow that would shatter the window and drag us out of the vehicle's safety. But in that exact millisecond, the entire environment transformed. An incredibly intense and blinding white light flooded the darkness of the forest, projecting elongated, ghostly shadows of the trees onto the asphalt. The light came from the bend a few feet behind us. Accompanying the flash, a colossal mechanical sound far superior to any noise of nature cut through the early morning air. An 18-wheeled, thousands of pounds logging truck appeared on the road, its high beams on and its diesel engine working at brutal power. The truck driver noticed our damaged vehicle on the shoulder and blew the air horn, a monumental and prolonged roar that made the ground and the air vibrate simultaneously. The sudden explosion of blinding light and the deafening mechanical sound caught the creature completely off guard. The gigantic male suddenly recoiled, releasing the weight it exerted on my car door and shielding its sensitive eyes with one of its muscular arms. The monster's instinct for self-preservation against the approaching colossal mass of metal prevailed over its desire to hunt us. With an agility impossible for its absurd size, it spun on its heels and leaped into the dense vegetation at the side of the road, breaking through thick branches and disappearing into the deep darkness of the forest in the blink of an eye. The truck passed us, slowing down, the displacement of air rocking our wrecked car and bringing reality back to the environment. The primal threat had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, expelled by the brutal intervention of the human machine, leaving behind only the physical destruction of my vehicle and the permanent psychological scars that tore at our souls. The mechanical roar of the logging truck averted immediate death, but our minds were still fixated on those cruel yellow eyes. The driver of the immense 18-wheeled vehicle braked sharply about 100 feet ahead of our wrecked car, stepping out of the cab with a powerful tactical flashlight in hand. He ran toward us, illuminating the metal torn apart by the creature's claws and the sunken roof. I could barely process his presence. My hands remained gripping the steering wheel, and my whole body trembled uncontrollably. The man asked if we had collided with a grizzly bear or a giant moose, as the damage to the metal indicated immense animal strength, but my voice refused to come out. Sarah was crying copiously, a mixture of relief and panic, unable to form a single coherent sentence. The truck driver, noticing our profound shock and the complete inoperability of my vehicle, helped us out of the car and sheltered us in the warm, safe cab of his truck, which weighed thousands of pounds and seemed to be the only safe place within 100 miles. He used the radio to contact the county highway patrol, reporting a serious accident and an animal attack on the secondary road. While we awaited rescue, locked in that steel fortress, I stared intently at the edge of the dark forest, expecting at any moment to see the silhouette of that colossal 7-foot male emerge from the shadows to finish what he had started. The feeling of being watched by an invisible predator was suffocating. The forest, with its immense trees, was no longer just vegetation to me. It had become an abyss from which real monsters emerged to hunt. I knew he was there, hidden by the absolute darkness, analyzing our new position and realizing that we had escaped his clutches through sheer external interference. The putrid smell seemed to have permeated my clothes, a constant reminder that contact with absolute evil had left marks far beyond the torn metal of my car. County police cars arrived about 40 minutes later, illuminating the highway with red and blue lights that contrasted sharply with the darkness of the early morning. The officers questioned us about what had caused that level of destruction to my car. I knew that mentioning a half-wolf, half-man monster would land us directly in a psychiatric ward, so I simply repeated the trucker's theory about an abnormally large bear. However, the worst was yet to come. I needed to inform the police about David's accident a few miles away. When the rescue teams arrived at the location, I indicated the scene they encountered silenced even the most experienced officers. I was taken in the back of a patrol car, and through the window I could see what remained of Sarah's ex-boyfriend's truck. The vehicle was unrecognizable, the roof had been completely ripped off, and the heavy steel doors were twisted as if they were made of paper. The surrounding area, within a radius of at least 50 feet, was covered in a quantity of blood and destruction that defied any logic of a simple traffic accident. Police officers immediately cordoned off the area, and the expressions on their faces alternated between confusion and veiled horror. David's body was removed from the wreckage in a state I prefer not to describe in detail, but it was clear that no human force or mechanical impact could have caused that level of brutal mutilation. Authorities officially treated the case as a wild animal attack following a serious vehicle accident, attributing the fury to a hungry grizzly bear or an unusually sized puma, purposefully turning a blind eye to the fact that no catalogued animal in North America possessed claws capable of slicing through the chassis of a pickup truck or the strength to tear apart a grown man with such ease. The months that followed that night were a continuous decline for our mental health. Sarah never recovered from the traumatic shock of seeing the man who tormented her dismembered by a living legend, let alone having her own face just inches away from that abomination. She developed a debilitating phobia of any minimally wooded or dark environment. We broke the lease on our house in King County a few days after the incident and moved to the center of a concrete metropolis, far from any nature reserve or forest. However, the distance in miles was not enough to erase the psychological scars. Every time night fell and the shadows lengthened, I found myself obsessively checking the locks on the windows and doors. I completely abandoned any outdoor activity, camping or hiking, as the mere sight of tall trees swaying in the wind triggered panic attacks that left me breathless. The silence of the night was replaced by chronic insomnia, where my mind incessantly replayed the weight of the Dogman's impact on the roof of my car and the vision of those sulfur-colored eyes piercing me through the glass. Our relationship couldn't withstand the weight of this terrifying secret. David's human ghost had been replaced by a far worse entity, and looking at each other was a constant reminder of that rainy dawn where death walked on two legs beside us. We separated about a year later, not for lack of love, but for the inability to bear together the burden of knowing that the civilized world is just a thin, fragile film hiding ancient and cruel abominations in its densest shadows. The police investigation into David's death was quietly closed, and the official reports I managed to access months later through lawyers cited only a tragic swerve on the wet road followed by an opportunistic predatory attack. No mention of the 5-inch cuts in my car's bodywork, no investigation into the gigantic footprints that were surely left in the mud around the shoulder. The system acted quickly to cover up any trace of the inexplicable, preferring to keep the population in the comfortable ignorance that American forests are safe and controlled. I realized that the truth had no place in the modern world, and trying to openly recount my encounter with the Dogman would only get me labeled a lunatic or an attention seeker. The loneliness of carrying this experience is almost as overwhelming as the encounter itself. You walk through the lit streets of the big city, surrounded by thousands of people preoccupied with their routines, bank accounts, and mundane problems, and you realize how vulnerable everyone truly is. They don't know that just a few thousand feet from the highways that crisscross the United States, alpha predators that modern science pretends don't exist roam with impunity under the moonlight, possessing the strength to tear apart heavy vehicles and enough intelligence to hunt humans for pure sport. I carry the weight of knowing that we are not at the top of the food chain when darkness engulfs the forest. We are merely fragile intruders, tender meat packaged in metal boxes that offer no protection whatsoever against the true masters of the night. Today, as I look out the window of my safe elevated apartment, observing the city lights, I know that my worldview has been irreparably altered. I share this confession today not to prove anything to anyone, but as a grim warning, a necessary outpouring to ease the burden on those who have looked directly into the eyes of absolute evil and survived by a mere irony of fate. The Dogman is real. He breathes, he hunts, and he watches from afar, hidden in the vast forests that border our seemingly safe roads. If you are ever driving on a secondary route, miles away from civilization, and your engine fails in the darkness, pray that the silence is just nature sleeping, Because if you smell the putrid stench of death and feel the weight of gigantic feet breaking branches in your direction, know that no car lock will save you from what is to come. If this true account of extreme terror made your heart race and opened your eyes to the terrifying legends that lurk in the dark, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave a like if you were brave enough to listen to the end. Comment below what you would do if you were in my place, locked in that car, and share these scary stories with those friends who think the night is safe. I am Mr. Nightmare Scares You. And remember, the real monsters don't live under your bed. They're running around out there, in the shadows of forgotten highways, just waiting for you to decide to take a shortcut on the next dark night. Sleep well if you can, and until our next encounter with real terror,